Mallory and Xander by Gina Governale. Mallory loved collecting rocks. Some were smooth and round, some were rough and jagged, and some were something in between. Some were dark brown or black, some were soft gray or white, and some even had little shiny specks that looked like glitter if you held them up to the light. Every rock was different. Every rock looked and felt a little bit like the place where Mallory found it. Every time Mallory went to a new place, she brought home a rock for her collection to help her remember. Rocks were good for remembering. Usually, Mallory loved to go new places. She loved to go to parks and forests, to Grandma's house, or to the zoo. Usually, Mallory was excited to see new things, but today was different. Mallory stood at the window in her empty room. She looked at the place on the windowsill where she used to keep her rock collection. Now, the windowsill was empty. Carefully, she put the last of her rocks in the small cardboard box Mom had given her, touching each one to help her remember. She looked out into the backyard where she used to play with her friends. Now, the backyard was empty too. Mallory had helped Mom pack all her books and clothes and toys into boxes and watched Dad load them into the back of a big U-Haul truck, all except the sandbox and the tire swing. Those things, Dad said, were too big to carry. Mallory picked up the box with all her rocks inside it. She was glad that some things were small enough to carry. "Time to go," Dad called. "The truck is all loaded up." Mallory ran out to the driveway where Dad was wiping the sweat off his forehead. "Careful with them," she said as she handed him her rock collection to put into the truck. Mom was running her finger one more time over the highlighted line on the map that would take them all the way to Florida. "Climb into the car, Sweet Pea," Mom said, refolding the map. "Dad will drive the truck and we'll follow behind." Mallory reached down to pick up a small half-circle rock from the edge of the driveway and slip it into her pocket to help her remember. Mallory climbed into the back seat and hugged her knees to her chest. She reached into her pocket and ran her fingers over the rough edges of her half-circle rock. As Mom drove out of the driveway and down the street, she watched as the empty house got smaller and smaller and smaller. Suddenly, Mallory felt like her stomach was full of squirmy little worms like the kind she used to dig up in the backyard. Would Florida have a backyard that was good for digging for worms? Would Florida have a bedroom with a windowsill where she could keep her rock collection? Mallory didn't want to think about it. She held on tight to her half-circle rock, put her head down, and squeezed her eyes shut. "Mallory, wake up," said Mom. Mom carried Mallory out of the car and into her new house. So far, Mallory thought Florida had a lot of the same stars and a lot of the same dark she remembered from home, but she was too tired to really get a good look. That night, they all slept on the floor in the empty living room. When Mallory woke up the next morning, Mom and Dad were already outside unloading things from the truck. She stepped out the front door to get a good look at Florida in the sunlight. Even though Florida at night had looked a lot like home, Florida in the daytime looked very different. Mallory reached into her pocket and touched her half-circle rock to help her remember. That night, when the truck was empty and the house was full, Dad told Mallory that it was time to celebrate. "Celebrate what?" asked Mallory. "Florida," Dad said. "Our new home." Mallory looked down at her feet. She did not feel like celebrating Florida, but before she could say so, Dad reached down and scooped her up onto his shoulders. She held on tightly with both hands and couldn't help but smile, seeing the world from up so high. Mom, Dad, and Mallory walked up the street, around the corner, and down another street. Even though it was evening, it was still hot, but Mallory noticed that Mom and Dad didn't seem to mind. "Dad," asked Mallory, "where are we going?" "It's a surprise," Dad said. "You'll see soon enough." Mallory was not sure she wanted any more surprises. Around the next corner, Mallory saw what the surprise was. She had never seen anything like it before. Welcome to the ocean, sweet pea, said Dad. Mallory had never seen so much water in one place ever in her life. She had not even known that there was so much water. Mom laid out a picnic blanket on the ground, and Dad set Mallory down in the sand. She felt her feet sink in a little, and her steps were heavy as she wobbled to stand next to Mom. Mom and Dad sat down on the picnic blanket, and Mallory crawled to squeeze in between them and hold on to Mom's arm. Said Dad. I would have thought that you'd go running right off exploring, looking for rocks. Mallory buried her head in Mom's elbow. Are you sure you don't want to go look for a rock? Asked Dad. It could help you remember the beach. Mallory stood up and walked a few steps from the picnic blanket. She looked down at her feet, wandering a few more steps. She didn't see any rocks, just sand. She wondered if some other little girl would move into her old house and play in the sandbox in the backyard. She wondered if that little girl would move into her room and keep a rock collection on the windowsill. She wondered if that little girl's family would come and fill up the house with all the things from their own U-Haul truck. She hoped so. It had seemed the house had felt a little sad to be empty. "Hey!" Mallory heard a voice calling. "Don't step on it!" She looked up and saw a boy who looked about her age. She had been so busy wondering that she hadn't noticed him. She had almost walked into him. "Sorry," said Mallory. "Step on what?" "My collection," he said. "Do you collect rocks?" asked Mallory. "No," he said, giving Mallory a confused look. "Why would I collect rocks? Rocks are boring." "They are not," said Mallory. "Rocks are beautiful. Some are round and some are rough and some are dark or light or sparkly, and they are good for remembering. Besides, if rocks are boring, what do you collect?" "Seashells," he said, kneeling down in the sand to look at his collection. "I collect seashells." "And what makes seashells so interesting?" asked Mallory. "Well, seashells have lots of colors," he said. "Some are really small and some are really big, and when I take them home I can look at them and think of the ocean. I can remember." "Rocks can do that too," said Mallory. "They cannot," said the boy. "What could a rock help you remember?" Mallory reached into her pocket and touched her half-circle rock. "Home," she said. "They could help you remember home." "That would be a pretty boring home," he said, "if it was as boring as a rock." Mallory clenched her fists together. She picked up her foot and kicked the sand as hard as she could until all the boy's seashells were buried underneath. Then she turned and ran back to Mom and Dad as fast as she could. Mallory grabbed hold of Dad's legs. "Can we go home?" she asked. "We can head back to the house if you want to," he said, lifting her onto his shoulders again. "You're probably tired after such a long day. Now that the truck is unloaded, you can sleep in your bed tonight instead of on the floor. How does that sound?" "Can we go home?" Mallory asked again. "Well, I just told you we could," Dad said as Mom folded up the picnic blanket. "The walk will only take a few minutes." Mallory didn't say a word. She reached into her pocket to hold on to her half-circle rock. Her pocket was empty. The next day, Mom, Dad, and Mallory were eating breakfast in the kitchen when someone knocked at the door. Mom went to answer it, and Mallory saw a tall woman and a boy about her age. "We're your new next-door neighbors," said the woman, "and my son Xander insisted we come say hello to you this morning. I know it's early, but he said it was very important and would not be quieted. You know how children are." "Please," said Mom, "come in." Mallory jumped down from her chair to get a good look at the boy. Once she was sure he was the same boy from the beach, she felt that same squirmy worm feeling she'd had in the car on the way to Florida. "You dropped this last night," said Xander, reaching to hand her something. "I thought you'd probably want it back." Her fingers closed around the small half-circle rock. "You're right, you know," said Xander. "I looked at it last night, and rocks aren't so boring, especially that one, since part of it is rough and another part of it is smooth." "Thank you," said Mallory. And I brought you something else, too, said Xander, handing her a small seashell. I thought you might like to put it in your room and think about the beach and remember. Mallory looked at the seashell. It was smooth and round like some of her rocks, but also it was different. She held it next to her half-circle rock. Each looked and felt a little like the place it was found, and they looked good together.